We'll be doing LSU. So, head coach Brian Kelly enters his third season as the head coach at LSU. And I know he hasn't been able to win very many big games, not just at LSU, but when he was the head coach at Notre Dame. But when you look at his overall record as a head coach, you can't argue that he's a good football coach. And on the offensive side of the roster, starting at quarterback, uh, they have Garrett Nussmeier taking over for Jaden Daniels. And from what I've seen of him, I think that he's a good quarterback. So he played the bowl game and had 395 passing yards uh, and completed 68.8% of his passes and threw three touchdown passes and averaged 8.8 yards a throw, which was really good. And he also played the whole second half of the 2022 SEC championship game when Jaden Daniels got hurt. And he had in just half of that 294 passing yards and two touchdown passes. So I think he'll do a good job for them at quarterback. But what he's not going to be able to give them that Jaden Daniels did is a whole lot of athleticism. Nussmeyer isn't a runner. He didn't run any in that bowl game. And there were so many times last season when LSU was like third and 10, and it looked like Jaden Daniels was going to get sacked or at best have to throw the ball away, and then he'd take off running and pick up a first down. Nussmeyer isn't going to be able to do that for LSU. And I don't even think Nussmeyer is quite as good of a thrower of the football as Jaden Daniels, but he should be one of the better quarterbacks in the SEC. So at wide receiver, I think they're going to take a step back here. They lose two first round wide receivers, Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas, who are two of the best receivers that LSU has ever had. Uh, so they've got Kyron Lacey coming back, who I think has a chance to become the next great wide receiver for LSU. He had starting 10 games and playing in all 13 last season. 30 catches for 558 and seven touchdowns, averaging a really impressive 18.6 yards per catch. And he had two games of over 100 receiving yards last season, and he had six catches for 95 yards in the bowl game. So I think he'll probably become their go-to wide receiver this year. And then they brought in a couple of good receivers from the portal. They brought in a transfer from Mississippi State, Xavier Thomas, who had starting 11 or playing in eight or starting 8 games and playing in 11 games last season. 40 catches for 503 yards and a touchdown, averaging 12.6 yards per catch. And they brought in a transfer from Liberty, C.J. Daniels, who had last season 55 catches for 1,067 yards and 10 touchdowns, averaging 19.4 a catch. And then they have Mason Taylor coming back at tight end, and he's good. He has in 2 years, in 26 games combined, 74 catches for 762 and four touchdowns. And I think he'll become one of the best tight ends in the country this season. Now, running back is concerning for LSU. They don't have any running backs on their roster that have been great in college. And LSU's offense is going to need running backs more this year. So they averaged 204.5 rushing yards per game last season, which is really good. But Jaden Daniels averaged nearly 95 rushing yards a game himself. So Nussmeier, not being a running quarterback, is going to need running backs to help him out in the offense. And really good news for LSU. is their offensive line is still going to be one of the best in the country. They returned four out of five starters from an elite offensive line last season. They returned tackles Will Campbell and Emory Jones. Campbell only allowed 17 pressures and no sacks last season, and Jones only allowed 18 pressures and two sacks last season. And then they returned guards Garrett Dillinger and Miles Frazier. Dillinger only allowed 13 pressures and one sack last season, and Frazier only allowed three total pressures and one sack last season. And they do lose their starting center from last season, but they've got a great replacement for him. His name is DJ Chester, who played some, not just in garbage time last season, and played really well. Uh, so I think LSU will still have a good offense, one of the better offenses in the SEC, but for sure not as good as last year's. And LSU loses their offensive coordinator from last season, and I know a whole lot of their offensive success had to do with the line and Jaden Daniels and uh, Thomas and Neighbors at wide receiver, but a lot of it also had to do with the offensive coordinator. So on the defensive side of the ball, they were horrible here last year, giving up on average 27.4 points per game. And they gave up 30 plus points in 7 games last season. So they bring in a new defensive coordinator coming from Missouri, and he really helped fix Missouri's defense last season. They actually had a good defense last season, but LSU's defense was so bad last year, and they didn't make enough transfer portal additions to where I think it's going to take 2 years to fix their defense. But I think they can improve some this year. So I had seen before last season started that LSU secondary was probably going to struggle, and that was very right. Their secondary was horrible, ranking 115th in the country, giving up 255.6 yards a game passing. But I saw that their front seven was going to be one of the best in the country and one of the best in the SEC, and that wasn't even close to being true. They gave up 161 rushing yards a game, which ranked 85th in the country. And it wasn't the linebackers that let them down. The linebackers were good, but the defensive line was a huge disappointment. It was horrible last year. They couldn't stop anybody. And I think the defensive line is going to struggle again this year. They only have one starter returning, and they missed on all of the good defensive line transfers. So linebacker though still looks to be really good. This will be the strength of the defense again. They returned two starting linebackers of three from last season. They do lose one really good linebacker, Omar Spates, who is going off to the NFL. But the two that they return are two of the best linebackers in college football. Harold Perkins, who is one of the two, is also one of the best players in college football. So after the freshman season that Harold Perkins had in 2022, he was one of the most hyped up players going into the 2023 season. I would see his name all over the internet. But then when the season started, it was like he disappeared. And that wasn't his fault. He still had a really good year, but it was because LSU's defense was so bad that he didn't get any attention anymore. But he has in 27 games these past 2 seasons, 146 tackles and 65 total pressures and 13 sacks and 6 forced fumbles and 8 pass breakups and 2 interceptions. He's an amazing player, and he's no doubt going to go first round next year in the draft. And his best game ever was probably in 2022 against Alabama when he kind of beat Alabama by himself, getting after Bryce Young in that game. He's a type of player that can change the game by himself. He's so good. And then the other starter that they returned. Greg Penn had last season 89 tackles and 4 sacks and 2 interceptions and 10 total pressures and a forced fumble and a pass breakup. And the other starting linebacker will be Whit Weeks, who was a true freshman last season, a 4-star recruit. He played in 11 games and only started 3 last season, but still had 50 tackles and 5 pressures. And then in the secondary, I think they'll be improved at safety. I like their safeties. They returned Major Burns, who was the only good player in LSU's secondary last season. I'm sure he'll play in the NFL. He's really good. He had last season 90 tackles and 3 pass breakups and a pick six and a sack. And then they bring in a transfer safety from Texas A&M. His name is Jordan Gilbert, who had in 2022 in 11 games 61 tackles and 2 interceptions and 4 pass breakups. He barely played last season because of an injury, but he's supposed to be ready for the opener. But cornerback, I still think is going to be a problem for LSU. The corners are back from last season, but they were awful last year. They're going to have to play much better if LSU is going to do more than I think they're going to do this year. And then on special teams, kicker looks good. They returned their kicker who did a good job for them last season. And punter, though, is questionable. They're replacing their punter. So now moving on to the predictions. They start the year on a Sunday night against USC. So at the line of scrimmage in this game, LSU, of course, has a huge advantage over Southern Cal on the offensive line. But I actually think USC has a better defensive line than LSU does. And both defenses, I'm pretty sure, are going to struggle in this game. But I actually think USC has a more complete defensive roster than LSU does this year. Now, I know in the past Brian Kelly has been a much better defensive coach than Lincoln Riley has, and both quarterbacks I like, but I liked Miller Moss a little better than Garrett Nussmeier in the bowl game. And they're both going to have several receivers that are good to throw to. And at running back, neither team is elite, but I think USC is a little better than LSU there. And I think this will be a shootout and probably like a 48-45 type of game. Uh, and I do think, though, that USC's defense will come up with one big play and get a turnover in this game to win it. So then they play Knuckles, which will be an easy win. So then after that, they play on the road at South Carolina. So South Carolina can be a tough place to play, even when South Carolina is bad, which I think they are this year. But LSU is not going to be so good this year to where they can just dominate them, I think. So I think South Carolina will make this game competitive, but I don't think it'll quite go down to the end, and LSU will win by around 10 points. So then they play UCLA at home. UCLA, I don't think is going to be horrible like Colorado and Vanderbilt. They do have enough coming back and enough portal additions to where they can be okay, I think. But I still don't think this game will be that close. I think UCLA may keep it close for a while, but LSU will pull away late and win by around 2 touchdowns. So then they play South Alabama. This should be an easy win. Now, of course, I know what happened to Oklahoma State last year when they played South Alabama, but there's no way that I could pick South Alabama to upset LSU. So then Ole Miss at home. I think this will be a good game like it was last year. So Ole Miss's defense is really upgraded from last year, and LSU's offense is not going to score as much as they did last year without Jaden Daniels. So The score to this one last year was 55-49. I don't think LSU scoring anywhere near 49 in this game. And Ole Miss's defensive line is good enough now to where they can match up with the LSU's offensive line and slow their offense down. And LSU's defense, I don't think it's going to be able to stop Ole Miss's offense much in this game. Ole Miss's offense is going to be so good and so explosive this year, and I think they'll score a lot in this game. And I think that Ole Miss is just too good this year, and they'll win. So then they play on the road at Arkansas. I wouldn't be shocked if Arkansas pulled this upset. So this is kind of a rivalry game, and it's been close most of the time in the past, but LSU has usually been the winner. So I think it'll be close this time. Arkansas, I think, will be able to score some points on LSU, and I think this game will probably go down to the end. But I like LSU's quarterback a lot better and their offensive line, and I think LSU is just a little bit too good, and they've got more options at receiver than Arkansas does. And Arkansas doesn't really have a player like Harold Perkins on their defense. Their defense isn't going to be very good, and I don't really think they're going to be able to slow down LSU's offense much in this game. So I'm going with LSU. So then on the road at Texas A&M, this one I think will be pretty close, but uh, Texas A&M's quarterback Connor Wayman I think is similar to Nussmeier, and Texas A&M's offensive line isn't close to as good as LSU's, but they've got a great group of running backs that LSU doesn't have, and they've got several good options at receiver too. And I think LSU is going to have a hard time stopping A&M's offense in this game. And I like Texas A&M's defense a lot better than LSU's. I think their defense will get enough stops to win this game. They've got a much better defensive line and secondary than LSU does. So then Alabama at home, and they get a week off before this one. I think LSU will be a much better prepared to slow down Alabama's offense this time, and Alabama's defense isn't going to be as good. I don't think so. Even though LSU's offense isn't quite as good, I still think they'll get close to 30 points in this game, and I think Harold Perkins might have a big game on Alabama like he did in 2022 this year, and they slowed down Alabama's offense in the 20s in this game. And I'm not really sure that LSU's defense is even really going to be average this year, but I have a feeling that they're going to play pretty well in this game. And if this was at Alabama, I'd no doubt pick Alabama. And I'd pick Alabama in this one if it was a neutral field. I think Alabama's a better team than LSU, but I think playing at home, LSU wins a really close one. So then they play on the road at Florida, a possible upset game. I know Florida's a tough place to play, but I think Florida would have quit at this point because I don't think they're even going to have a coach. And of course, they barely do now, but who has called their coach, I think, will have been fired at this point, and they'll just have some interim head coach. And I do think this will be competitive, but I think LSU will end up winning this one by around 10 points. Florida just doesn't have a very good roster. LSU has a much better offensive line. Now, Florida does have a decent uh, quarterback coming back and some good receivers, and they've got one good running back. But Florida doesn't have the linebackers like LSU does, and their defensive line is not very good either. So then they have Vanderbilt. This will be an easy win. Vanderbilt's going to be horrible on both sides of the ball like they always are. And then they end the season against Oklahoma at home. I think this will be a great game, a really close one. So I like Oklahoma's defense much better than LSU's. I think they'll slow down LSU's offense, but LSU's offensive line is so much better, and I like Nussmeier better than Jackson Arnold in the bowl game. Now Oklahoma does have a, a lot of good receivers and running backs, but I have a feeling with this game being at LSU that LSU is going to get this win. So my final prediction for LSU is 9-3 overall and 6-2 in the conference. And for LSU to go to the college football playoff, they'll have to at least get to 10-2. And for them to do that, their defense is going to have to make a huge improvement. And they just don't seem like a playoff team to me right now. They seem like a team that can probably make it in 2025, though. And I think they could possibly do worse than this and maybe even just go 8-4. But that will be it with this video, and please subscribe and thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon.